Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar on SAP HANA Analytics, Lessons Learned Deploying an Enterprise Data Warehouse on HANA. First, you'll be hearing from Rob Jerome, our VP of Innovation and Technology, and then from Manager Pradeep Kalapalli. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, you can submit them through the Q&A dialog box on the right, and we'll go ahead and answer some of those at the end of the webinar, and then follow up directly for any of those questions we don't cover during the webinar. So with that said, I am going to pass this off to Rob Jerome.
Great, thanks Spencer. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Great, thanks everybody for joining today. As you know, Dickinson and Associates tries to do about 3 webinars a quarter in the area of innovation and technology. So from an SAP perspective, that's typically database, data management, analytics, and application development on the cloud. We're really excited about today's webinar. We're going to take a little bit of a different approach to some of our past webinars. This one's going to go a little deeper. There are a lot of customers out there that have deployed HANA from a transactional system perspective, but also from an analytics perspective. And what we want to do is really talk about some of the technical lessons learned. I always joke with customers and say, hey, it's just like any platform. You have to make sure you do things correctly. Otherwise, can you have, God forbid, the slow HANA? You absolutely can have slow HANA. So we're going to talk a little bit today about the right way to deploy, some best practices from a technical perspective, from a naming convention perspective, and really dig a little deeper than we typically do on these types of webinars. So from an agenda perspective, we'll go through a few introductions. Project overview, typically what's different about a HANA Analytics project than a traditional analytics project. Why sidecar? And then some activities associated with the project. So pre-development, what do you do first before you even hit the keyboard? Development, including best practices from a technical perspective, from a process perspective, and from a documentation perspective. And then frankly, some real, I'll call it the number 6 would be the Dickinson secret sauce to a certain extent, some additional good practices that we've discovered in our projects. And then finally, we'll open it up to the group for questions and answers. Next slide. So great, on the phone today, I'm Rob Jerome. If you know me, everybody calls me RJ, but I am Vice President of Innovation and Technology here at Dickinson and Associates. I've worked with SAP for 19 years, always in the area of application development, analytics, and data warehousing. I manage what we call, again, innovation and technology, and that's database technologies, all SAP, the EIM suite, so data quality, data integration, application development on the SAP Cloud platform, and business objects, both the cloud and the traditional solution. On the phone as well, we've got Pradeep Kalapalli. Pradeep is a manager in our group, and Pradeep specializes in SAP HANA deployments. I'm proud to say that Pradeep was the 4th person to join our team about 5 years ago, and he's one of the original members. So I'm very happy to have Pradeep speaking today. Next slide. Very quickly, before we get into the meat of our webinar today, Dickinson and Associates. So if you've attended one of our webinars before, or perhaps you're a customer, you know a good deal about us. But if you haven't, welcome, and a little bit about Dickinson. So Dickinson and Associates is a gold channel partner with SAP. We're a software reseller. We're certified. We call it Partner Center of Excellence certified to maintain software for SAP, and we implement SAP. And we do that across several lines of business. I've mentioned mine, the innovation and technology line, and then we have 2 others, what I call traditional ERP, S4 HANA, ECC, and then S4 HANA Cloud. We're a lighthouse partner and actually a customer for SAP for the S4 HANA Cloud application. We've got about 150 full-time SAP professionals, and what really sets us aside is our team has an average of about 15 years of SAP and 19 years of business experience, which sets us apart from our competition. From an offices perspective, location perspective, we're a Midwest company headquartered in Chicago, but we cover basically all of the United States. We've got satellite offices in Cincinnati. That's where our Application Managed Support Center is. Annapolis, Maryland, where I live. Dallas, Texas, New York, and Scottsdale. And finally, our tagline is business people who know SAP. If you meet some Dickinson folks, you'll find that most of us come from industry. I started my career, SAP career, 19 years ago on the customer side, working for Black & Decker. And if you talk to some of our folks, you'll find that most of us have come from the customer side and then moved over into this, the business of consulting. Next slide, please. So our focus and our strengths, very high level, but from a focus perspective, again, ERP from both an on-premise and a cloud perspective. So that's S4 HANA, that's S4 HANA Cloud. The SAP Analytics Cloud, formerly known as Business Objects Cloud. HANA Analytics, which is our subject today. SAP Cloud Platforms. You probably come to one of our other webinars about the SAP Cloud Platform and building apps, custom apps on the platform. And then other cloud applications. Our expertise really is in implementation, and we're experts in SAP software. And from an industry perspective, we cover pretty much most industries, but if I were to say where do we specialize, manufacturing, mill products, distribution, consumer products, financial services, and we already spoke about locations. So again, I'm really excited about today's webinar. We're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive than we typically do, so it might get a little bit technical, but that's okay because we want people to be aware of how to do this right. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Pradeep, and I hope you enjoy the webinar.
Hi, everybody. My name is Pradeep Kalyapalli, and I'm a manager with Dickinson in the Innovation and Technology team. Over the last 12 years, I have been helping different companies with their data needs, whether it comes to finding out where the data resides, whether it is extracting, transforming, and loading data, or modeling the data in such a way it is very easily accessible to the end user in the right format at the right time. So then they can make some informed decisions based upon what they get, what the data they get. Over the last few years, I've been mainly focusing on the HANA sidecar implementations. And after many projects, I have learned a lot of lessons on how to implement these projects more correctly. And I want to share those lessons with you today. So initially, let us talk about what a project typically looks like. So the main goals of these projects are basically we start with one application area. So we set up both the HANA and the business objects 3-tier landscape, that is your dev, wares, and prod. And the main purpose is to create a data foundation within the HANA sidecar for analytics. That means we are not only catering for the KPIs for the project, but also create a full-scale data foundation which can further be leveraged by the clients to build their own analytics on top of it. So a typical, there will always be some reports as an deliverable, and generally we use Business Objects VI toolset for that, which the users are going to get access to. So from a project team and timelines perspective, we generally have a project manager, an architect, HANA modeler. Then we also have an administrator who will also be a data provisioning expert, whether it comes to SLT for replicating or ETL for data services. So we also have an expert there. And one of the important persons in the team would be your functional SME. Generally, he's a person from the client side who knows the business process well. And we very much engage with him during the blueprinting phase to understand the client's business process and go into a development with the inputs what we take from him. And we have a report developer, and typically it takes for one application area, it's a 12 to 16-week project. That is what most project timelines have been. But again, as a note, the resource estimates what I've just talked about is a typical sidecar implementation. And this always varies depending upon the requirements and the level of customizations that we would require to do at the client side. So coming to typical project milestones and the project planning, we take a hybrid approach here. So generally, the project scoping, setup, and blueprinting, we go with a waterfall approach. But when it comes to realization, we take an agile approach. We run sprints, we develop things in sprints, and then we go into the testing phase for each sprint and then do a UAT, and finally the cutover and go live. So the question, why HANA sidecar? So traditionally, what we have seen, before HANA, what we've generally been doing is we have an OLTP system where all your transactions are happening. and then we load things into a data warehouse. We have to worry about the delta mechanisms, how you're going to load it. Then we store the data as is in the initial data stores. Once we load all the data in the initial data stores, then we start transforming the data to the fashion that is required for the project, and then we load things into a cube. Again, for a performance reason, we've been building indexes, aggregates on top of those cubes, and then typically we'll do any additional calculations required for the KPIs to be delivered. This is all part of the data warehouse. But once the data warehouse is built, we used to generally build data marts, or in the BW space, we can call them as Bex queries. And finally, we go to the BI tools where we build those individual KPIs for the end users, and that is how it gets delivered to them. So this is a pretty lengthy process. It requires a lot of resources, time. If I need to make a change, so the change would not be easier. So it has to go through a big development life cycle and so on. So the new approach is, like, with HANA coming in, what we take the OLTP system, replicate the OLTP data into HANA as required. So based upon what tables are required, we replicate those tables. That means when a transaction happens in your transactional system, immediately it gets posted into HANA. So on top of HANA, we load data only once in HANA. So there is no redundancy of loading the data in multiple tiers, transforming the data and all that stuff. So once we have things loaded once, we build views on top of it. In the views, we kind of do all the transformations required within the views itself. And finally, this can be exposed to the BI tools directly, which gets to the end user. Since there is no lot of data loading data redundantly, like the development life cycle in a HANA sidecar project, which comes down drastically. So let us start with some pre-development activities. I mean, when we go ahead and start the development, before starting the development, your systems are installed, like, the connectivities and everything are looked after. So once we start that, like, the first and the foremost thing within HANA Sidecar that I generally do is make sure the change recording is turned on. So once the change recording is turned on, like, any development object that you create and activate will actually be assigned to a change list, or in a traditional SAP terms, assigned to a transport. The second thing is the generating time. HANA has got its own calendar, so it basically can create two different types of calendar. One is a Gregorian, and the second one is the fiscal calendars, which are used by the client. So Gregorian is your regular, starts at January 1st and ends on December 31st. And the fiscal calendar, based on the variants that were described within your transactional system, we build the fiscal calendars as well. So how do we do this? So you can go into the HANA modeler and you can use this generate time data application. So some of the things when you have to remember when doing generating time or the calendar tables within HANA are basically, make sure if you're using fiscal calendars, make sure all the fiscal variant tables are loaded. That's the first thing. And the second thing, also keep in mind, depending upon the granularity of the data, like, the table gets generated, the size of the table gets generated. For example, in the screenshot, if you see, if you're doing an year, month, or a week, or a day granularity, you can generate up to or less than 50 years of data. But if you're going to much deeper, if you have analytics where you have to report it by the hour or by the minute, in those cases, like the calendar which gets generated reduces drastically. Like for an hour, it will be 30 years, seconds would be 5 years, and so on. So keep that in mind. And the second thing is coming up with a package structure. So the package structure is nothing but how would you organize your development objects. If any of you guys are coming from a BW background, we used to create info areas. This is much similar to that. So we took the HANA Live approach and we kind of modified it a little so that it will be more reusable. In this case, you see in the picture, you see the level 0, we start with the client package. So anything, all the client development objects afterwards needs to go underneath these client packages. The second one is depending upon the project. So in this case, I'm building a BI project. It's a BI project or a BI application that I'm kind of building. So that would be my level 1. Similarly, if I have to build other projects like security, or if I'm building an API, so those can be other level 1 packages that you can put it under the client, L0. So again, the concept of the package, again, the level 1 package is also to attach these packages to a delivery unit, and the delivery unit is generally the bus which transfers your development objects from one system to the other, that is dev to QA to prod. So sometimes, generally we go with one project as one delivery unit, but there were instances where depending upon the number of people working parallelly in the same project, we have to create some multiple delivery units. Let us talk about the BI project itself. So if you see the package, we basically divided the BI project package into 3 sub-areas. The first one is data, the second one is models, and the third one is services. So let us talk about the data a little. So many a times you have to create custom database objects, whether it is a table or a database view or a sequence, a trigger. So all these things, the DDL goes into one of the sub-packages within data. Similarly, if there are some complex calculations that you have to do and you cannot do it in a regular graphical view, then sometimes you might have to write a stored procedures. So the stored procedures also have a place within the data. And then if you have to schedule, yes, HANA can schedule a job. So you have to build jobs, and that is why we have a jobs folder in there, and also the files or images or any other files that you have to custom load. So that's a place for the data. The second one is coming to the models. Within the models, we generally divide things into the master data and then different application areas. So I have MD, which is my master data. Then I have different application areas like OTC or P2P and so on. So let us talk about the OTC piece. I mean, you have in the picture you can see there are 3 different sub packages there. One is a base, then you have a query and a reuse. So let us quickly talk about what does the base package include. Generally, a base package includes your views, which are as is as from your transactional system. So let us say I take my customer data. So I build my customer view here, but this has to be as is from the ECC. So no transformations, no calculations, nothing has been done. So then why do we need it, right? So the main purpose is, if you see ECC or any other data sources, the namings would be different. They might not be the business names. So what we generally do here is give a good technical name and a label to those fields, which I'm using, which will be used for the reporting for the project itself. So that is one thing. And the second thing, let us get to the reuse. In the reuse views is where you will kind of combine and put all the additional logic. You might combine your header data with an item data, and if you have any special logics, anything going on, all those logics and everything generally, and you're going to do it in a reuse view. And finally, once we have all this, you can build a query, or which is more or less like a star schema here. So you can have your facts, and the facts will be joined to all your dimension tables, which will go into your query views. This query views are generally what is exposed to the end users, where they can take this particular view and report on top of it. So now let us get to the last L1 package, which is called services. Sometimes, in projects, you might have to send the data out. So if you have built the views and you want to turn them to a web service, using OData or using JavaScript, and you want to send that out to any applications on the cloud, this is where you create those services. So that was one of the reasons why we have the third package for services as such. So this is the package structure. So let's get to the next one. So very preliminary database object, which is schema. So plan your schemas in advance. Would strongly suggest that. So depending upon different types of extraction, like, create different ones. For SLD, create a different schema. If you're having data services also, create a different schema for that. But apart from that, create a schema just for the project itself. For example, for BI, I would always create a BI project. The reason for me creating these 3 different schemas is one thing, you can have a better security model when you do this, and you can secure your data more clearly. And the purpose of the custom schema is tomorrow, let us say you have to create any custom database objects. Let us say I have to create a sequence or a trigger or a store procedure. So these things can be put in this particular schema or the application schema. So another very important thing that I want to talk about is the schema name. Keep the schema name consistent throughout your landscape. So don't come up with schema names which will say ECC Dev, ECC QA, or SQL and Dev. Don't give where the next system you go into, you create a different name. The reason why I'm saying that is there is a way you can project it. You can do something called a schema mapping, but if you are using any sort of SQL, scripted SQL and all that stuff, managing different schema names in different systems would become really hard. So keep the schema names very consistent, throughout your landscape. So another thing is you can create a schema directly writing a SQL, create schema SQL statement, but I would strongly suggest any object that you're creating in a project, make sure it's a design time object. So HANA provides us these design time objects for schema. It is HTTP schema file. So you create it using that. The reason being, if you created it with the HTTP schema file, you don't have to go to QA system, open up the system, and rerun your SQL statements. So when this object goes into the HTTP schema file, goes into QA, and it gets activated after the transport, the schema automatically gets generated in the target system. So we don't have to open the QA and prod systems for every time you are creating a new schema or a table or so on. So another thing, what I want you to remember is when you create a schema with the HTTP schema file, initially the owner of that schema would be sysrepo, which is a pre-built user which comes with your HANA install. So in order for you to assign this to a user or a particular role, you need to run the store procedure which I have mentioned here. So once you run the store procedure, it gets granted, the rights on the schema gets granted to the role of the user that you have mentioned in the call statement. The next one I want to talk about is tables. So again, like I said, we don't want to use SQL statements, store them, take it to the next system and rerun those SQL statements. Rather, here we started using the HTTP file. So there's a little difference between here because the HTTP file, the data definition file, uses CDS as its language. It's not SQL, so you can see it in the screenshot how I have created a particular table, a column table. It is very much similar to SQL, but do take a little bit, keep an effort, and try to use this. So again, not all database objects can be created using a HTTP file. So you can create tables, table types, views, etc. But when it comes to store procedures, sequences, and you might not be able to use the HTTP file. So again, let us see what are the advantages of using the HTTP file for creating tables. Like I said, the transporting these files into the next system, which becomes very easy. Again, all the tables are created as design time objects in the schema that you have mentioned. Then the version management is possible. And finally, adding and removing columns within a HTTP file is very much simple. It's basically changing this file, and you can see the effects of it immediately. And before we start any development, every project needs some naming standards. There are no hard and fast rules here, like, from a naming standard perspective. But what I always say is, a standard and consistency is what makes a best practice. So come up with a standard of what best suits your organization, but be consistent with it. And that is the best practice. Some of the most common practices we've been seeing in different projects with different clients is they might use uppercase, lowercase, camel, or a Pascal case. So you can see the examples there. Coming to some of the rules, consistency. That's the main thing. Setting up, again, the naming standard should be very easy. If a developer needs to go and look at document before naming any object, it beats the purpose. So keep it simple, but so that any developer can easily understand it and and start using those conventions. Again, create singular names for the tables. If you're doing it, name it as customer instead of customers. So that will help you because it is an entity that we are talking about when it comes to a table. So keep the table names singular. So if you have to do word separations, do with an underscore. The reason being is in some of the projects we have seen data sources where we had spaces between the table names or there was a hyphen. So when we need to take the data out and put it to a different application, we will have some issues in those regards. So I would strongly suggest, either don't leave any space between the table names, or if you have to do it, if that is your standard, go with the underscore. Again, don't drop syllables in your field names unless it is a common abbreviation within your company. And also don't use some obscure acronyms which your end users would not understand and which is more IT driven. So when it comes to stored procedures or functions, always name the actions, what this stored procedure or function does. So the action has to be in the name. This update the product table, right? Or calculate the total working days. So keep the action in the naming. So if you have to use prefixes, be consistent. If you are creating a stored procedure, you can put an SV. And again, if you want functions, you can discriminate it by an FN. Do that, but be consistent. Now, once all these things are their standards or everything are set up, we can get into the development phase. So initially, when HANA rolled out, we had different kinds of views. We had attribute views, analytical views, and calculation views. But now, after SPS 8 and further, we started building everything as a calculation view. The calculation view has different data categories, like I have mentioned, which is a dimension cube or a cube with a star join, right? So let us understand about it. If it is a dimension, it is more or less like your attribute view. The purpose, the default node, when you set the calculation view as a dimension, would be a projection. And only attributes, no measures. What I mean by that is you can have attributes which have a number data type, but you cannot have aggregation associated to that. So only attributes, but no measures. And typically this is not available for reporting. The second one is cube, which I would say is your calculation node in the earlier days. So the default node will always be an aggregation, but what you have to keep in mind is at least one measure needs to be defined. That means you have to, for one numerical data type object, you have to mention whether there is a sum, min, max, or you have to define an aggregation type. And the third one is this is what is available for reporting. Now the last one, generally I use star joins in the 3D views. So the default node when you select calculation view as a star join would be a star join, what you see here. So it simplifies the design. I like this a lot because it very much simplifies your design. And if you're in the database, the term is the third normal form is possible, which means you design your entities or facts separately from your attributes, and which can further be joined as a star join. So this reduces a lot of duplication effort. You have to define all your attributes like customer, material only once. And this can be further used in different PD views wherever it is required. So easy maintenance too. So those are two main things. One is it reduces all the duplication effort, and also it's very easy to maintain. And after that, let us see some of the common settings within the calculations view. I've picked a few which I think which would be very useful, and I have seen different clients where they have not implemented this. That is why I'm taking these particular settings specifically. If you see, most of you guys who have seen HANA, you can see that name and the label aggregations and all that. But the label column is what I've seen many people are missing. So if you associate a label column, for example, for material, I have associated another field called material description to material as a label column. What it does is in your reporting tools, it is associating your key with the text. For example, when I open this view in analysis for Office, you could see that I can see both the key and the text side by side, so it makes the user's life easier. He does not have to guess what it is. So you can see both the key as well as the description right there itself. So this is one thing. And the second one I want to talk about is extract semantics. So what it basically does is, let us say you define all your labels, the label columns, on all this stuff. Since we are doing a stacked approach like HANA Live Views, where we are using base, reuse, and query, what I strongly suggest is go ahead and name the semantics as low in the lower views as possible, so that when you're building the reuse or the query views, you can just hit on this extract semantics and copy whatever the semantics you have mentioned in the lower views. One of the biggest advantages is when you're creating so many views, there is always a possibility where you name something like material as a material in a lower view, but somewhere in between you change it to material number or in the description. So when you use this extract semantics, it copies whatever is the semantics that you have defined in the lower level, and it gets pushed to the next level. So this is a very strong functionality, and I use this always, so keep that in mind. So the other settings I already covered the data category, what dimension cube and qubit join means. Then the default client. So there are two options here, you have a cross client and a session client, especially when the data is coming from SAP. Each of the SAP table has gotten a key column called a client. So depending upon, if you go with cross-client, when you're querying that particular view, you see the data from all the clients. But if you set it up as a session client, you have to make sure that the user ID, when it is created, it is assigned a session client. So when that particular user runs it, the data gets filtered to that particular session client, what it was mentioned there. Then the third one is the applied privileges. If you are creating any analytical privileges where you want to further restrict the data at a row level, this has to be, you need to turn this on. You have two different options of classical and SQL. So you can use those, but if you do not have any criteria where you have to restrict your data at a row level, you can leave this as blank. Then let me come to the cache invalidation period first, and then I'll go with the executor. So from a cache invalidation period, let us say there are some views which do not change often, and what you can do is you can set up a cache invalidation period as a day or an hour, where the data gets stored in the cache for the time you have selected here, and this sometimes improves performance a lot. But you always have to make sure that the data is not getting updated very frequently in this case. So executing. So generally, what we've been doing is, if we are using a stacked approach, or if you are using HANA Live, so the executing, we put it as SQL engine. So this helps in the performance a lot when you're doing a stacked approach kind of a modeling. Then the last one I also want to talk about is input parameter and variables, and one particular setting in that, which is called view or value help. So let us say you have built this very complex view in HANA, and you kind of took it to the reporting, and you created a variable on top of it. So especially when you try to open the variable and you're seeing some time where it is refreshing for a few seconds before even the data shows up for selection. That is because it is basically executing the SQL on that big complex view. So what we do is, for example, in this currency, I have created a master data base view, which I can use it here. So for the field selection, this actually execute on the master data view instead of all this big complex view that you have created. So the user experience would be a lot better when you are using this. So this is very similar to if people have come from the business objects where they have built universes and stuff. This is nothing but your list of values that we used to use. So this helps with the user experience, when he's trying to open a report and run something. So the next one I want to talk about is stable functions. So there are things things in the model. When you're doing model, not everything can be achieved using a graphical model. So sometimes, you might have to script it out. So initially, in the earlier days, we used to have a calculation view with a scripted calculation view, where you were writing either in SQL or in a calculation using the CE functions. But we strongly, for the last couple of years, we've been using the stable functions a lot instead of creating the scripted calculation views. One of the biggest reasons is, when you're using a scripted calculation view and it is there in part of your model, when it executes the whole select statement within the scripted calculation view. And when you're using table functions, what I suggest is it's a function. Create it in such a way that it acts as a function. For example, if you see the return table here only contains my key and what are all the attributes that I have calculated. So, for example, here I'm trying to calculate something called a shipping day and the total shipping days in the month. So, and my key, this has to be joined to my fact table using my, sales order created date or a delivery date or something. So what I'm doing here is I'm just only putting the date as the key and just whatever I calculated. So I can easily join this with my fact table, and even when the query execution happens, it is not running for the whole, select statement. So some of the features about the table functions here, it's a user-defined function. Second thing is it can accept input parameters. The output is a result table, so it is actually a table. The output will be in the table, and it is only a read-only read-only, and it can accept only SQL script. So I'm stressing on the read-only because there are no side effects to it. You don't have to worry that if it is something wrong, some table gets corrupted or anything. There are no update insert statements that you can use within the table function. So the only thing is a select, and with that it is side effect free too. How do you execute it? If it is a stored procedure, generally we call a stored procedure. But in case of table functions, what you can do is you can add it in the from clause of your select statement, and you can see the data. And once the table function is created, this can be further added into a projection in your later view. And that is how you can do the additional joins and get it into as a part of the model that you have been creating. Let us talk about time attributes, because every project needs a time attributes, right? Some of the info, first thing is make sure when you're defining time attributes, first thing, make sure your tables are time tables are already generated. The second thing is get a clear-cut definition of what each time attribute is. One of the common things is when we are using YTD. So you have to clearly understand, what does YTD mean? YTD, does it mean January 1st to the current date or SIP date, or is it based on what the user has entered? Get a clear-cut definition of each of the time attributes. And for reusability purpose, what I strongly suggest create a separate time attribute view, and this can further be, you can leverage it in any other model very easily. So, for example, what I have done here, if you see the screenshot, I created something called, I used the table function here, where I've created simple calculations for current year, or the current year. The way I generally calculate is, I create something called a rolling year, which means the current year would be 0, then the next year would be +1, the previous year would be -1, and so on. So one of the best things about creating rolling year, it can be easily used within as a restricted key figure. And similarly for YTD, I have created something like a Boolean value, like where a particular date is it a YTD or not. I have given a yes or no kind of an indicator for YTD. And this I'm using it in the restricted calculated key, as a restricted calculated key figure, where I'm mentioning my sales order net value. I'm restricting it by rolling year and the YTD. So and in similar way, you can create different time buckets, whether it's QTD, MTD, and so on. The next one, some of the common in most of the projects, is the material UOM conversion. So one thing, SAP does provide standard UOM conversion functionality, but the UOM conversion is for the standard ones. Let us say you're changing something from kgs to pounds, or from Fahrenheit to centigrade, and so on. But when it comes to very specific to the material conversions, which are actually very user-specific, or the company-specific, all the conversions in ECC are maintained in a MOM table called MMOM. So the best way to do this, what I found was, first thing is create a view for MOM. And within the MOM view, what you're creating, you can create two calculations. One is a conversion factor to base unit of measure, and conversion factor to alternate unit of measure. How do I do that? So there is a field, if you see the table, you will see something called a numerator and a denominator field. When you divide numerator by denominator, the conversion factor for base unit of measure is calculated. And if you reverse it, denominator by numerator, you get the alternate unit of measure calculation. So that's the first thing that you need to do. The second thing is, if you see most of the transactional tables, let us take VBAP or VBRP, there is always a column where you'll see the quantities are already converted to base unit of measure. You have a column for where you'll find quantities in transactional unit of measures, and then you'll also find columns which are already in base unit of measure. So if you already have a column with base unit of measure, you don't have to convert, you have actually convert it into base unit. Rather, what you can do is you can join this to the material or the MOM view that you have created using the material on the unit of measure, and you can basically multiply that with the conversion factor to get for the same material all the different alternative of unit of measure quantities. Now, either you can use a restricted key figure, to create individual buckets, like maybe building quantity in cases, each is using restricted key figures, or if you want the end user to choose, what unit of measure, you can always create a variable on top of that, where it automatically restricts it to that particular alternative unit of measure. And another thing I also want to cover is the currency conversion. This is pretty much a standard functionality which is given by SAP. And you'll see that the first and the foremost thing is you have to load certain tables from ECC, the TCAR or the currency tables, into HANA. For example, if you do not have ECC, you can also think of creating something similar tables where all these conversion rate, exchange rates are maintained. So there are certain things you have to, what you can do is when you define a measure, you can define the measure with a semantic with amount with currency code. Once you define that, it gives you this window where you have some basic things that you have to mention for the application to convert the currency. For example, the schema. So where do these tables exist? So which schema do these tables exist? That is the schema that you have to mention. Then the second, again, like I said, SAP tables come with a key field called client. You have to mention what client we have to use to get the exchange rates. The third one would be a source currency. Source currency would be generally the currency in which the transaction happens. So you need to mention, like you can select that column in the view which says this, what is my document currency. And the target currency could be your input parameters that you have created. So if the user wants to run it in USD, like you can create an input parameter where the user enters USD in it, and that is what the system is going to take as a target currency. The next one I want to talk about is exchange type. Like if you see these tables, there are different kinds of an exchange types. So what I mean by that is sometimes like say exchange types are maintained by yearly average or a monthly average or a daily average. So choose what kind of an exchange type that you require for your project, and also mention the conversion date. So do you want to do the conversion based on today's exchange rate, or do you want to do the conversion when the transaction actually happened? In that case, you give something like an invoice date or sales order created date and so on. You can actually choose those columns. So once you give those, like, more or less the system does the job for you, and when the user runs the report, all your currency fields are already converted to what the user has chosen. So some more good practices here is if you're coming from a BW background or something, when you're doing HANA sidecar, SQL is a mandatory skill that you'll require. So it makes your life much easier. So make sure your project members, at least some of your project members are well versed with the SQL querying language. The second thing is, use graphical calculation views whenever possible, because it's got its own inbuilt performance measures that have already been taken. And if you're using scripted, it is as good as how good you scripted it. So whenever possible, try to use the graphical calculation views. Again, do not create the scripted calculation views, rather start using the table functions instead. Some of the things when you're doing a join, if you're unsure about the cardinality, don't mention the cardinality, whether it is 1, n, m, n, don't mention it. You can leave it blank, the system will determine. But if don't give a wrong cardinality, because I've seen where it was hitting some performance, we were getting into the performance issues. If you are using a stacked approach, we talked about this like the HANA Live or how I've showed it to you, is always execute things in a SQL engine within the calculation view, which is a property there. And one of the most important things when you're designing, always keep in your mind your filters, keep the filters as early as possible. When I'm talking about filter, like it's not just a filter that you need to put on the view, but even when it comes to variables. Let us say you have joined time in a query view, and you're using one of the time attributes like month in the final query view, and you're trying to use that in a variable. Instead of that, if in the base view where you have the sales document date, if you have created a month column there itself, what you can do is the variables generally push down the filters to the lowest level. And if the field exists in the base level, that is how the filters get pushed to the base level, and the performance really works out. I mean, we learned this the hard way, and in one of the projects, and we kind of found out when you're modeling something, make sure that the field which you're using in the variable is at the lowest level possible. So again, avoid filters on calculations. For example, in one of the clients that I've been working, so there was this master data view that I had to create, like, which is very complex. So in BW, it was taking almost like 8 hours, which when it came to the HANA, when you, you kind of created the view, it was about a minute, less than a minute. for the view to execute, because this has to go to, it has to read the whole database, do some 12 iterations and so on. What you can do is, if you know that this is not a real-time kind of an attribute, if you know that it can be materialized, do materialize that view and use that materialized view of the field within it in your variables. So another thing, one piece of advice is when you're creating nested calculations, which means you're creating a calculation within a calculation in the same aggregation node, please do understand that so you have to keep in mind whether this particular calculation needs to happen before or after the previous aggregation happens. So give that a special thought when you're anytime creating nested calculation measures in the same aggregation node. Okay. So finally, let us talk about some BI tools integrations. So one of the practices that we've been doing is whenever we are creating users in HANA who are just reporting users and who do not need access to HANA Studio, we create them as restricted users in HANA. So the second thing is also configure something called Bob J HANA single sign-on. This is not a passwordless kind of a single sign-on, but it is basically the trust between Bob J and HANA. That what it basically does is, if a user logs into Bob J, HANA does not have to authenticate the particular user again. So it basically trusts that Bob J has already authenticated the user, and it just passes through. You don't have to put in your user ID password again for HANA. So there are different ways of achieving this by certificates or HANA or Kerberos. Of all the most, we found that SAML is the most preferred one and it was most friendlier one. Again, if you're using SAML, be a little bit careful. SAML is very case sensitive, so the user ID, what you created in business objects, should exactly match by the case when you're mapping it in HANA. So some of the connectivity options with Bob J. So you have you can create a relational connection and build a universe there on top of it and use it in your reports. Or you can create an OLAP connection which can directly connect to the view. But if you're using analysis for Office in your organization, the regular OLAP connection does not work, so you might have to create an OLAP HTTP connection. This is not by default introduced into business objects, so you have to basically enable it. So I have given the SAP note number on how to enable the HTTP connection. And apart from that, there's also another caveat where there's a pre-delivered role in HANA called an INA role. So that role needs to exist for the HANA user in order to access analysis for Office using the OLAP HTTP connection. So depending upon the front-end tool, again, there are different ways of you can also use freehand SQL and etc. But choose what's best for your organization. So I think I've taken pretty much of the time. So hope you guys enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, I can take them now.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Appreciate that, Pradeep. Looks like we have a couple questions we'll try and get to. And again, if there's any additional questions we don't get to, we will follow up with you directly. So first question I have is, does S4 HANA Embedded Analytics replace the need for a separate analytics environment, such as a HANA sidecar?
So let me understand the question first. Are you saying the embedded analytics on S4 HANA, and do you still need a HANA sidecar? So I think it's the company's decision. The main purpose, we've always seen is keep your analytics separate from your transactions. S4 HANA is also pretty good, the embedded analytics, but it also depends upon the complexity of your analytics. If you are designing some really complex models, then I would surely suggest to have a separate HANA sidecar. So that you don't come into a situation where when people are running these when people are running these complex calculations on S4 HANA, take down the system or anything like that. So it depends upon the need and what kind of customizations and the complexity you have in your organization.
Okay, perfect. And then the last question we'll get to here is, do most customers use the combination of HANA and SAP BI tools, or are there options to use non-SAP analytics solutions as the front end?
So again, we are an SAP shop. We always the integration with when it comes to business objects is more or less seamless. But again, there are there are other reporting tools in the market which can directly connect to HANA as well. So I'm not denying that. But when it comes to the integration part, we've always preferred to use business objects.
Perfect. All right. So thank you, Pradeep and RJ, and thank you to all who are able to attend here. Again, for the additional questions we didn't get to, we'll follow up directly to provide those answers, and we hope you enjoyed this webinar. With that said, thank you all for attending, and hope you have a great day.